This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. In this episode, I'm joined by historian and publisher Robert Dickins, who spent the past 2 decades uncovering the fascinating and often misunderstood history of psychedelic fungi in the UK. We explore the surprising story of our native mushrooms, from their elusive growing habits to the cultural, legal and social forces that have shaped how we interact with them today. It's an eye-opening conversation that challenges assumptions and reveals a hidden side of Britain's natural and cultural landscape.
So I'm a historian and publisher. I've been working on the history and literature of psychedelics for the best part of 20 years. I've been publishing in the field as well. My interests sort of lie in, well, they started off in the literary histories, really. So it was looking at kind of writing by people like Aldous Huxley and Alan Watts, and has kind of expanded into broader histories. Over that time, I've been sort of collecting bits and bobs specifically to do with fungi and mushrooms, which is what's led to my latest book, Psilocybe Pickers.
I'm glad you said that. So I pronounce it psilocybe, but I'm assuming your pronunciation is the best one. So that's psilocybe. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Psilocybe.
Okay, I shall note that going forward. So when we talk about psychedelics in the UK, how many native psychedelics do we actually have in terms of fungi?
So a lot of it's down to the definition of what you would call a psychedelic. So in terms of fungi specifically, the most famous one's Amanita muscaria, or the fly agaric mushroom, the famous fairy mushroom that's red with white spots. But is that strictly a psychedelic? Well, its 2 main ingredients are muscimol and ibotenic acid, and levels of which are very different depending on which mushroom you pick. And you get a whole range of different reports, from just making you vomit right through to kind of Alice in Wonderland experiences of things growing and getting smaller. Sometimes it's kind of stuporific and sends people to sleep as well. So is that strictly a psychedelic? Some would argue yes, some would argue no. In terms of the psilocybe species, I believe there is about 12 or 13 known ones to grow in this country, most of which have only been kind of identified and discovered in the last 20 or 30 years. The most famous one, the Liberty cap, it grows profusely in just about every county in the whole of Britain. But the earliest records we've got of people taking it or even understanding it is probably like 1799. There's a famous poisoning case, but it really wasn't truly identified as a psychedelic until the 1960s. So in terms of psychedelics, Britain is actually kind of free of them in some respects. We've been in a kind of alcohol and opium culture for a very long time before then.
I was really blown away to know that actually that's the short history of our discovery of native psychedelics in the UK. I just assumed it had a lot longer history. But going back to what you said about the 20 to 30 species, will they all be picked and used as psychedelics if the person's that way inclined? Or is it just the Liberty cap that people tend to stick to?
It's overwhelmingly the Liberty cap that people in this country pick, and nearly all accounts that I've found have been of the Liberty cap. Now, there are some people who are really specialised in this area, not just mycologists, but also just general drug and fungi enthusiasts who will go looking for the other ones. But the vast majority, 99% of picking, is going to be the humble Liberty cap mushroom, Psilocybe semelanciata.
It seems to be a very unresearched or undocumented area of study. So when you're talking about the other species as well, do they vary in terms of the effects that they have on people or the quantities of the psychoactive substance, or is that just still a bit of an unknown?
Well, so just take the Liberty cap on its own. So far as psilocybe species mushrooms go, it's got quite a high quantity of psilocybin and psilocin, which are like the 2 magic ingredients, if you like, along with a few others, but they're the main ones. And all the different species have slightly different levels of them. Most of them are slightly weaker than the Liberty cap, and there's a few which are slightly stronger. But the drug itself is the same. So the poison is in the dose, as they say. So it really depends on how many you're taking. So the effect, if you took a relative amount of a strong one but you took more of a weaker one, would basically be the same.
And in terms of effects, are there many factors involved? Because you hear of people who've had, like a good trip, bad trip in quote marks, or it's had different effects. Does that depend on the individual? Like you said, it depends presumably on the dose, but does it depend on where the mushroom's been growing, the time of year? Has any research been done into that?
I don't know that any strict research has been done into that. I mean, ultimately, the experience is always geared around the old mantra being set and setting. So the set of your own mind and the setting in which, the place in which you take it, they're going to be the kind of overwhelming factors which dictate the type of experience you have. Like most of the historical accounts, and even more recent accounts from the 1970s and 80s, you find that young kids, like children taking them, seem to have more of a good time in terms of they're laughing more, the whole thing's a bit more of a game, whereas because they're a bit less loaded with less set, if you put it like that. So adults tend to sometimes have much more difficult things going on in their lives, and that's often reflected in the experience itself. So that's not really to do with the environment where the mushroom comes from, and that's specifically with the Liberty cap. So if you look at the fly agaric again, that actually, depending on where you pick it, the levels of the chemicals it contains can be quite different. But a Liberty cap's pretty standard wherever you find it.
Did you say the Psilocybe semi-lanceata is the UK native?
Yeah, that's the most famous UK native, yeah.
And then do they grow in other countries as well, the psilocybes?
Well, the genus grows all around the world, and the Liberty cap itself can be found in North America and across Europe, probably beyond as well. Definitely in the Northern Hemisphere. But then, there's lots of different species of psilocybe worldwide. So Americans tend to gravitate towards Psilocybe cubensis, which grows there, which doesn't grow natively here. But it is grown here because it's easy to grow from a mushroom grow kit, Psilocybe cubensis is. Whereas the Liberty cap, no one's figured out a way to artificially grow it. So the only place you can get a Liberty cap is from the ground.
That's fascinating. So they really object to cultivation.
They really object to it. They really do. And, you might have the pickers talk about having their favourite spots to go picking, but they're not going to appear year after year in exactly the same place. They tend to turn up precisely when they want to turn up, if you put it like that. They've almost got a slight mind of their own, which is, I guess, the association with them being pisky and fairy-like is that they do seem to have a sort of mind in their own in terms of where they grow and when they come up.
And do they have like a relationship to a tree or a particular area?
So they tend to be found in fields. They're not forest growers. They don't hybridize with trees or anything along those lines. They're not fully coprophilic, meaning growing out of dung, but they do like fields that are well fertilized. So you're not going to find them in a field that's been used for growing grains and that sort of thing. It'll be where animals are being put out to pasture. So
grassland, presumably.
Exactly, yeah.
And year round, do you find them, or are they more specific to a particular time period?
Just in autumn, you'll find them. They emerge at kind of different times in like different parts of the country, as you'd expect, like just because of the change of weather and kind of the temperate region that you're in. So the very earliest, they might possibly start appearing in August, late August, like very, very early in some places, often in Wales where it's very rainy because they like that sort of atmosphere. And then they usually kind of disappear with the first proper ground frost.
So obviously you said that they occur in North America and that, there's different species in the Northern Hemisphere. Is there a longer tradition of using them as psychedelics in other countries than there is in the UK? Because like I said, I was just so shocked by the sort of short relationship that we have with them here.
Oh, yeah. Well, in Mexico specifically, which is where the kind of Gordon and Valentina Wasson famously were two amateur mycologists who rediscovered the continuing use of psilocybe mushrooms in a ritual context amongst the Mazatecs in Mexico. Specifically, Maria Sabina was the curandera or healing woman who provided them with these mushrooms and who they sat and had a session with. So yeah, that's kind of documented for hundreds, probably thousands of years in that part of the world. But then there's this curious thing in Europe, which is, explains part of the reason why there's so little documentation in this country, which is we're quite mycophobic in the past. There aren't lots and lots of words to describe lots and lots of different types of mushrooms. Like there's a couple that we ate, and that was all we really said about it. Whereas if you go to Eastern Europe, for example, they have a very, very rich mycological language to describe all the different type of mushrooms, and they're more kind of mycophilic, as in they love mushrooms. So there's different parts of the world have this kind of strange and differing relationship with them. Britain has had a quite phobic relationship with them over the years, and other places, like in Mexico, and they've got a long history of ritual use, have a much more positive relationship with them.
When you read a lot of literature around mycology, much is made of that tradition of ritual and of culture around using psychedelics. And, I think there's this idea that, whatever you're using should be kind of revered and it should be used responsibly, and that it should have this kind of framework of a cultural use around it. And obviously we don't have that in the UK. So have we been using it long enough to build up that tradition, or is it maybe just not that important with this particular mushroom?
Well, I think there's two things to say to that. One, nowhere does it say you have to have a long tradition and a way of using them. Every culture will approach these things differently. We've developed our own rituals. If you take MDMA, for example, which was, a relatively new drug when it burst onto the scene in the 80s, it was less than 100 years old. We developed whole rave rituals around them, which is just as ritualistically important gathering together as dancing as it is in a mioca in South America. And with mushrooms, we've had now 4 generations of people who have definitely been picking mushrooms in this country. I mean, there could well have been people picking them in undisclosed areas of the past that we have no record of. But we now have a record of 4 generations doing it, and people have developed their own different relationships with them. And like strict ritual vigils, if you like, are just one aspect of that. I mean, mostly mushrooms have been used as gathering party drugs. Now, people think party drugs is pure hedonism, but actually that's still people gathering together to dance and have a good time. So I think we've developed our own kind of unique relationships with them. Over like 40 or 50 years, it's meant that, even in different parts of the country, people have different relationships with them. And I think that's one of the beautiful things I found in my research, was that there was no overarching narrative of this is what you're meant to do with them. It was a series of different people, unconnected from each other, discovering their own ways to have a relationship with mushrooms.
And of course, it's difficult to document because they are now, I'm going to let you explain this better and in greater detail, but they are now illegal, as I understand it, to possess and to use. So that's got to make your job a lot harder, presumably.
Well, it's interesting. Actually, the reverse is true in some respects. The only reason that most information exists that I found in my course of research is because of court cases, newspapers reporting on the dangers of people picking mushrooms, because people weren't writing about it in terms of their own experiences, but newspapers were writing about it, doctors were writing about it, the government were releasing memos and circulars about it. It's actually the process through which that they've gained this unique position by having possession and distribution outlawed that's given us a kind of unique angle on what was happening. I can only identify there are lots of people picking in every single county in Britain because I can find records of court cases and newspaper articles from every single county in Britain. So conversely, they've put it underground, but at the same time, they're wildly advertising it. And this is one of the brilliant things from some of the newspaper articles that come out in the late 70s when the whole kind of mushroom scene really starts blowing up. So if you imagine there really hadn't been much of a mushroom scene across the country, and then in the late 70s, it really starts kicking off. And one of the big drivers of this was a New Statesman article that came out in about 1976, which not only warned people about the dangers of these substances and reporting one of the first court cases, they also very handily described what they looked like, where you can find them, what an appropriate dose would be. So it's kind of the people who are, warning against using them are also the ones who are spreading the information to the largest amount of people at the same time.
So going back a step into the drive to make these things illegal, was it founded on some bad experiences or hospital admissions or some dangerous situations? Where did this stem from, this desire to stamp out the use of them?
I mean, it's a very interesting and slightly complex question. I think there's a degree of paternalism within the political class. So it's not really a politically left or right thing. Both Labour, New Labour, and the Tory party all had a hand in trying to clamp down on mushroom using culture. And I think that stems from a paternalism, which is the state knows best for your health, ultimately. But they had sort of different ways of tackling it. You imagine there's two distinct but slightly overlapping groups who kind of engage in this activity. On the one hand, you've got all the countercultural folk who emerged out of the kind of London underground scene. They were squatters and they moved into the kind of new age traveling and festival touring scene of the 70s. That kind of heavy counterculture thing was very heavily policed. That was their approach to it. They introduced laws, heavy-handed police approaches to try and stamp out what they saw as kind of immoral countercultural behavior, something which was going against the grain of Britain. But on the other side of it, you had basically local working class folk from all across the country, usually young teenagers, in very local scenes. They weren't, attached to any great countercultural movement. They were just young people exploring life. And their approach to them was the more medical side. So this is where you find the doctors warning about cases of poisoning and, picking the wrong mushroom and them going to hospital. But the Poisons Board released an article in about 1982 looking at the previous 5 years, and they basically found that no one had misidentified and eaten the wrong mushroom in that time. So there was a lot of warnings based on nothing. The medical stuff was a lot of hyperbole, like on the whole. So I can only imagine it stemming from this idea that some control was needed. But what happens with the picking in the mushrooms is ultimately is that a kind of an accord is reached between the state and pickers, which is that, they try little methods to stop it happening, but ultimately this settles into, if we catch you, we're going to fine you like £100. And it became a bit of a way of raising money by the government in the end, which was just, if we catch you, we're just going to fine you and take some money and then send you on your way. Things didn't really change. The law wasn't pushed to really being changed in 2005, which was the moment where having fresh psilocybe mushrooms, possession of which was made illegal. I should probably backtrack slightly there and say basically there'd been a loophole for the previous 30 years, which meant that it was absolutely legal to possess fresh mushrooms because the law stated that it was the chemical psilocybin and possession of which was illegal. But that loophole was closed in 2005. And that came about not because of people picking in fields. In fact, it's barely mentioned if you read the kind of parliamentary papers on it. It came about because of people selling them in shops and a huge export, import and distribution network, which had opened up between Britain, the Netherlands and the wider Northern Europe as well. And it was actually ended up being an economic reason that they closed the loophole rather than the individuals going out and picking mushrooms, which I think is quite surprising.
So what is the current law today as it stands?
Currently, it is illegal to possess or distribute psilocybin mushrooms, whether they're dried or fresh.
Doesn't mean if you had them growing in your lawn, you would be arrested.
No, because you're not in possession of them strictly. But the moment they were picked. Now, I'm not one to try and circumnavigate the law, obviously. However, it's fine to have spores. Spores aren't counted. So you could, have all the gear to grow them yourselves, and that would be fine. But the moment those spores took root, if you like, then it would become illegal to possess them. Or if you ate them straight out of the ground, like a cow, you wouldn't have the problem either, because at no point were you in possession of them.
Although you might be in possession of them in your stomach, but it's a bit late by then.
It doesn't count, yeah. But the other thing is, there are provisos in the law if you really get down to it. No one should ever really get busted with them because it says in the 2005 bill, if you're found with them, but you said that you've picked them in order to dispose of them for the good of the community, then that's fine as well.
Oh my God. Do you know what? This is just exposes the ridiculousness of the British law system, I feel like, at times.
It does. It also exposes the ingenious nature of the Britain, who for 30 or 40 years has basically been wrestling with this loophole in the law and pushing it to its limits to try and get round it as well. So they were trying court cases that were becoming more and more specific, say, is putting them in a bag, does that count as preparing them, even if they're fresh? Is refrigerating a fresh mushroom a way of preparing it? And all of these things get tested in court over and over again as Britons try and find ways to circumnavigate the law.
Wow. And also waste taxpayer money in the process, by the sounds of it.
Well, yeah, definitely a lot of money was wasted on that. To the point, New Labour just lost their cool basically in 2004, and they just thought that's why they brought the law in, and they just made it as unambiguous as possible, whilst, however, leaving enough of a wiggle room of ambiguity for those who wish to jump through the hoop.
And what category of drugs are they classed as?
They are Class A.
Are they? Oh, wow.
They are.
Okay. Well, again, learning curve. Yeah. So okay, yes, you can stamp that out, or you can try and stamp that out if you're the government. But it does sort of bring into question the fact that there are, I think, and I mean, again, not through any sort of personal research, but I suspect there are other psychedelics that you can find in your garden. And where do you draw the line if you try and outlaw all of these things that people are capable of using?
I mean, the lines are so arbitrary. Like, so when some of the more modern laws were introduced in the mid-1960s, which eventually got bundled up into the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act, there were ministers in Parliament debating, well, mescaline is outlawed, but what about the humble cactus itself? And, people were saying there's a legal trade in cactus which have mescaline in, and it's exempt. Like, peyote plants were made exempt. And the same thing for like LSD and morning glory seeds. And they were like, well, there's gardeners using morning glory seeds and growing them in their garden. We can't make possession of those illegal. So exemptions were made for plants. I mean, it's part of the reason that the loophole was created, because a lot of judges back in the day, arguably rightly, saw a difference between a synthesized chemical and something which grows naturally in your garden. And that distinction was very clear then, but it's become less clear over time.
Okay, well, we're getting to the end. Unfortunately, I could chat to you for hours, but is there anything that we've missed off?
Well, I think it's good to remind people that they shouldn't do anything that's going to get them in trouble with the law.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good point. And also, you've written a book. That's how I found out about you. I bought the book. Where can people go and find out more? Do you work for a society as well?
I don't work for a society. I mean, I speak at psychedelic society meetings around the country, just as a guest speaker. I work with Breaking Convention, which is the biennial, I should say, conference on psychedelic consciousness, which is a gathering of about 15 to 1,800 people every 2 years, currently being held in Exeter, usually, which brings together psychedelic researchers from across the world. It's a big international gathering, so I do work with them as well. But if people want to get a copy of Psilocybe Pickers, they can either head over to psychedelicpress.co.uk, or it's available through Amazon, or if you head into any of your local bookshops and ask for a copy, they should be able to get one in for you.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to Robert for such a fascinating and thought-provoking conversation. If today's episode has piqued your curiosity about the hidden stories of plants and fungi around us, you might also enjoy episode 371, Wild Edibles, and episode 136, In Search of Mycotopia with Doug Beerend. You'll find links to both in the show notes, and, as always, thank you for listening. Next up is Benny with his Insect of the Week, but first here's a word from our sponsors, The Roasting House.
There's nothing like a nice cup of coffee outside on a spring day. Hello from The Roasting House. We're a small, family-owned coffee roastery based in South Yorkshire. We love coffee, but we're also passionate about protecting nature and trying to keep our footprint as small as we can. At The Roasting House, we offer delicious coffees from around the world, carefully selected from farms that use nature-friendly methods such as shade growing, soil conservation, and maintaining wild areas for native wildlife. We roast in small batches using an energy-efficient roaster and filter the smoke to remove carbon to reduce air pollution. Roasting House coffee is packed in home compostable packaging, and we know that it actually breaks down because we've tested it in our own compost heap and worm farm. Order at roastinghouse.co.uk, and if you mention Roots and All or the Insect of the Week at checkout, we'll send you 25% extra free coffee as a thank you for supporting us.
The orange ladybird. Scientific name, Helitzia sedecim-gutata. Now, this is my second ladybird to be featured. I really like ladybirds. I think they're very underrated, and I think in the last kind of 10 years since I've been looking at insects properly, they forced me to look a little bit closer. There's so many different color variations in certain species. There's so many doppelgangers. There's so many overlooked species. I really think we all need to take a little bit more time and look at ladybirds. I think we kind of sometimes dismiss them as kind of children's insects, but there's a lot going on, actually. They're pretty cool. And even the UK has a decent diversity. Helitzia sedecim-gutata is a bit of a mouthful, and I do apologize if I've mispronounced anything there, but the etymology is fairly straightforward. Helitzia is coming from the Greek for roaming or wandering. Sedecim-gutata is Latin. It's quite straightforward. It's 16 sedecim, and gutata is spotted or speckled. So that's fairly straightforward. It usually has 14 to 16 spots on it. As the name suggests, it's a beautiful orange colour. The spots are white. It could be confused with a cream spot ladybird, but if you're not looking closely, any ladybird can be confused, to be honest. There's so many different variations, as I've mentioned. Harlequin ladybirds has over 100 known colour patterns and colourways, so always worth taking some really good photos and trying to be precise if you can with the ID. The ecology is really interesting. The orange ladybird feeds on mildew, typically on ash and sycamore. I always see it on ash in London. I think that's fascinating. I know mildew is not always a good thing. I guess many perceive mildew to be problematic in all cases, but I'm sure there are upsides, and this sounds like an upside to me if this is providing a food source or something. So that is interesting to me. And ash, doing okay in London at the minute. I know ash dieback's a big thing. Sycamores, plenty of them around too, as it stands. This species hibernates as an adult in leaf litter, in little cavities in the nooks and crannies on trees. I see it on posts, on fence posts, tucked away at the minute. Maybe they're just starting to kind of emerge and come out into the sun on a sunny day. They also can turn up in moth traps, as they can be attracted to the lights. And they're quite rare as you go north up into Scotland and the UK. I think it's a wonderful little species to keep an eye out for. I've been seeing quite a few recently, but I think they can be overlooked. Even if they're tucked away, they're not as obvious as, say, a 7 spot, the first one I featured. So I'd love you to spot a few orange ladybirds and tag me in. As always, please do record on the apps iRecord and iNaturalist, because all the data is valuable, even for the relatively common species.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.